Hey good people, Dr. Lund here. During the last 4 weeks, both mainstream media as well as social media has been full of ongoing reports of the horrific murder of 4 students from the University of Idaho that happened on November 13th. The initial report from the coroner indicated that all 4 of the students were stabbed to death, and police had reported as well that the murder scene at the house that all 4 were in was an extremely bloody scene, something that they had never witnessed before. Along with the 4 students that were violently murdered, there were 2 additional students in the home at the time during the murder. However, they reported they did not hear anything or see anything. The news of these murders have to create a sense of fear, shock, and horror to all people, but especially to parents who have children that are attending college or of college age. Murder is a crime that has a profound and life-lasting impact on the victims' families, friends, and the community. The sudden and violent nature of a murder leads to a particularly intense and unique type of grief for those directly and indirectly affected by the loss of that person. There are a number of awesome channels that will give you the details and updates to this specific case. However, what I want to do is I want to focus on some of the family dynamics and issues that a grieving family would deal with in this type of a situation regarding the murder of one of its members. For many families, this scenario starts with that god-awful call that one of their family members has been murdered, which then sets off a chain of events where the family has to not only process the information that they're hearing, but learn to deal with the police, a coroner, other investigative agencies, and on some level, the media. The shock and trauma of having a family member murdered can affect personal relationships, work life, social life, physical and emotional well-being, values, and beliefs about the world. Because of the intense shock the family experiences from the sudden and unexpected death of their family member, that in these early stages, most families require a lot of practical assistance in dealing with things like liaison with agencies, notifying families and friends, organizing the funeral, dealing with, again, the police, funeral directors, coroners, things that can be extremely confusing and foreign to the family members at this point in time. One of the most significant problems that family members experience is picturing the graphic thoughts and the violent nature in which the person had died, imagining if the person suffered pain or actual memories from the crime scene itself, or having to identify that person at the morgue. Many family members in this situation describe the feeling of isolation and being alone, particularly when media or social media places some blame on the victims themselves, or there's a stigma that's attached to the death and the murder. They also describe The feeling as if no one really understands the depth of their grief, which is not inappropriate, and may have some unrealistic expectations of the time it's going to take for them to be able to heal and move forward. In situations where the body of the loved one has not been located, or there continues to be questions and unresolved issues around who was the perpetrator of the murder, family members described an unsettling, ongoing, and persistent grief process that may have some moments of relief, but overall, the symptoms of grief persist for a long period of time until some of these issues can be resolved. So consequently, in cases where there are unanswered questions, family members will often report that there is a constant level of grief throughout a long period of time that they talk about seeming to adjust, that it's going to be just part and parcel of their now everyday new norm. Due to all the intense emotions and confusion, families are usually in their most vulnerable position in a situation similar to what the families of the 4 victims of Moscow, Idaho are going through. Trying to navigate new experiences such as dealing with the media, dealing with police, dealing with the FBI, dealing with a funeral and vigils, puts families in a very vulnerable position regarding how to navigate who to trust and who has a secondary agenda. As we've seen in the Idaho student murder case, communications with the family is absolutely paramount. More often than not, people from the media sometimes becomes the closer ally to the families of victims than the police and investigators, merely because of the time and the assigned job that they have. Now, we as humans, we usually need someone to blame for unfortunate things that happen. And when we don't have someone who's been identified, that anger and frustration can get targeted at many different people in many different directions. And sometimes that includes the survivors of a particular attack. Many family members have talked about the horrific guilt that they have for blaming individuals who were at the crime scene but survived, and blaming themselves, especially if they're parents, for not being there when their child needed them, or for allowing them to go off to college. It's also not uncommon for parents of a murdered child to blame one another for actions or inactions they had taken during the child's life, which ultimately and unfortunately leads to the demise of the family and the marriage. In many cases, the guilt, the grief, the sadness, the shock, and the horror can absolutely paralyze an individual. And in other cases, all those emotions will make an individual overcompensate by becoming more hostile, more obsessive about issues that may not hold a great deal of significance, but to them It may be their only way to feel that they're in control of something about the situation. And as difficult as it is for the parents, it is probably all the more difficult for siblings and friends of the murdered victims, because their sense of support, strength, is now affected by the fact that the parents are going through tremendous trauma and grief and shock and anger, that very oftentimes the roles in the family are no longer structured the same, which can give siblings of that murdered family member a sense that nothing is cohesive, nothing is stable. Now, on top of all this uncertainty and chaos in the family system, most people have never had to deal with police, FBI, investigations, and so we have little knowledge or experience about how these processes work, and it can be very frustrating due to the delays, the lack of information, and feeling that the family of the victims have very few rights in the situation. More often than not, each person in the family needs to have their own support system in order to help shepherd them and navigate them through their own process of grief. Oftentimes, children don't want to bother parents or engage parents and talk about their feelings for fear they're going to add to the grief that they see their parents experiencing, as well as parents having to deal with the details of an investigation, funeral issues. They may often miss the signs and symptoms of what the siblings are going through and are unable to provide them some structure and support that they need to feel that the family unit is still intact. As you can see, this is a very complicated scenario and situation for a family to find itself trying to navigate and putting one foot in front of the other. And in addition, dealing with this in the public eye, which most families are not accustomed to doing. There's no right or wrong way or accepted timeline on how to deal or how long to deal with grief. In addition, losing your sense of safety and feeling safe in light of someone's murder also complicates the grief process and can significantly change how you interact with society and how you allow your family to react with society in attempts of keeping them safe when you felt like you didn't keep the victim safe from such a brutal, murderous attack. So, in following this very tragic case, the one thing that I know for sure is the lack of communication between the families and the police, the investigators, the coroner, funeral directors, media, support professionals, and among and between family members can significantly hinder the grief process and complicate the emotions for these families who are already dealing with some horrific emotions. I thank you all for watching and listening, and I know our thoughts and prayers go out to the victims and the victims' families, and all the professionals who are involved in finding the killers of these innocent young people.